The hum of the private lounge at LAX was a low, monotonous drone, a sound Julian Vance usually found soothing. It was the sound of exclusivity, of a world buffered from the chaos of the public terminal. Today, it was grating. His flight to the Singapore summit was delayed, an unscheduled engine check, and the disruption felt like a personal affront. Julian's world was built on schedules, on predictable outcomes and controlled variables. A delayed jet was a crack in the foundation. He stared through the floor-to-ceiling glass at the tarmac, his reflection a sharp, severe silhouette in a $1,000 suit. At 38, he was the CEO of Vance Innovations, a titan of the tech industry, a man whose net worth was discussed in financial journals with a kind of hushed reverence. But his reflection showed none of that. It showed a man alone, bracketed by empty leather chairs. A commotion near the lounge entrance broke his concentration. A child had spilled a bright orange juice box, creating a sticky, vibrant puddle on the polished marble floor. A janitor appeared, pushing a cart with a quiet efficiency that seemed almost apologetic. He was a tall, black man with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it had weathered more than just long work shifts. Beside him, a small boy, his son, Julian presumed, stood with a drooping head, the empty juice box still clutched in his hand. Julian's lip curled in faint disgust. He paid a premium for this lounge precisely to avoid such mundane, messy realities. He watched as the father knelt, murmuring something soft and reassuring to the boy before beginning to clean the spill. "Some people have to make a mess, and other people have to clean it up," Julian muttered to his reflection, the words laced with an acidity he didn't bother to conceal. "Guess that's the order of things." The man, Marcus, paused his wiping, his back stiffening. He had heard. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the comment beyond that subtle, telling tension. He simply finished his work, mopping the floor until it gleamed, his movements deliberate and dignified. As he stood, the little boy, Leo, dropped a piece of paper. It was a crayon drawing of a soaring airplane, sketched with a child's earnest imprecision. It fluttered to a stop near the toe of Julian's Italian leather shoe. Julian glanced down at it, then back at the man and boy, who were already walking away. He felt a brief, unfamiliar pang, not quite guilt, but something adjacent to it. He nudged the drawing with his foot, then turned back to the window, dismissing them from his mind. Marcus returned a moment later, his eyes avoiding Julian's as he bent to retrieve the drawing, his expression unreadable but for the careful way he handled the small piece of paper, as if it were a precious document. A week later, the Singapore deal was a success, but the victory felt hollow, another digit added to a bank account he rarely thought about. On the advice of his doctor, who had warned him about stress levels that were statistically alarming, Julian had started taking a 30-minute walk through the small, manicured park adjacent to his office tower. He hated it. The forced serenity felt fraudulent. It was on one of these walks that he saw them again. The janitor from the airport and his silent son were sitting on a bench, their heads bent together in concentration over a large, intricate model of an F-16 fighter jet. One of the wings was fractured, a piece of the delicate fuselage snapped clean off. The man, Marcus, was trying to reattach it with a tube of cheap superglue, his large hands looking clumsy and out of place against the fragile plastic. Julian, a mechanical engineer by training before the siren song of corporate ascension had lured him away, felt an old instinct twitch. The angle was wrong. The adhesive was inadequate. The stress on the joint would never hold. He found himself walking toward them, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel path. "You're going to need a 2-part epoxy for that," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "And you need to clamp it. That glue will just crystallize and snap under the slightest pressure." Marcus looked up, and recognition dawned in his eyes. It wasn't hostile, but it was profoundly weary. The look of a man who had long ago learned to expect very little from the world. "I'm aware," he said, his voice a low baritone. "It's what we have." The boy, Leo, looked up at Julian, his eyes wide and dark and full of a startling intelligence. He held up the broken wing piece as if an offering. Julian's carefully constructed wall of indifference wavered. He saw the problem, the elegant engineering challenge of it, and the part of him that existed before the boardrooms and betrayals wanted to solve it. He sighed, loosening his tie. "Move over." Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second before shifting, making room on the bench. Julian sat down, the fabric of his suit feeling absurdly out of place. He took the model, his fingers assessing the damage with a practiced touch. The internal spar is cracked too, he diagnosed. We'll need to reinforce it from the inside. A small carbon fiber rod would be ideal. He looked at Marcus. Do you have a pin vise? A micro drill? Marcus gave a small, wry smile. I have a paperclip and a pair of pliers in my truck. For the first time in what felt like years, a genuine, unforced laugh escaped Julian's lips. It was a rusty, unfamiliar sound. He spent the next 20 minutes improvising a repair, talking Marcus through the principles of stress distribution and polymer bonding. Leo watched the entire time, his gaze flitting between Julian's hands and his face, his silence a palpable, curious presence. When Julian had fashioned a temporary but surprisingly sturdy splint, Leo reached into his backpack, pulled out a drawing pad, and quickly sketched. He tore out the page and handed it to Julian. It was a picture of a tall, frowning stick figure with a tie and a smaller stick figure next to it, holding up a fixed airplane. Above them, a bright yellow sun was smiling. Julian stared at the drawing, a strange warmth spreading through his chest. He had closed a 9-figure deal that morning, but this simple, silent thank you felt more significant. He found reasons to walk in the park after that. He told himself it was the fresh air, the doctor's orders, but he knew he was looking for the man and his quiet son. He found them there most afternoons, working on the plane. Julian started bringing tools from his home workshop, precision drivers, hobby knives, a tube of industrial-grade epoxy. One overcast afternoon, as they were meticulously sanding a seam on the repaired wing, Julian found himself asking the question that had been hovering in his mind. "Your son?" he began, trying to sound casual. "He's a quiet kid." Marcus's hands stilled. He looked out across the park, his gaze distant. The air grew heavy with unspoken history. Julian expected to be shut down, to be told it was none of his business. Instead, Marcus spoke, his voice soft with memory. His mother, Sarah, she was a pilot, bush pilot in Alaska before we met. She loved flying more than anything. When Leo was 4, she was co-piloting a small charter flight. A sudden ice storm, no survivors. Julian felt the air leave his own lungs. All the trivialities of his day, the market fluctuations, the production delays, evaporated. Leo was with me at the base when I got the news, Marcus continued, his voice steady but freighted with pain. He heard everything. He understood more than a 4-year-old should ever have to understand. He hasn't said a word since that day. The doctors call it traumatic mutism. He talks, just not with his voice. He gestured to the drawing pad in Leo's lap, where the boy was now sketching a cloud. He talks with his hands. Julian looked at the small boy, who seemed so fragile yet so focused, and then at the father, who carried this immense silent grief with such profound grace. He saw now that Marcus wasn't just a janitor. He was a survivor, a protector, a man who had sacrificed everything to build a quiet harbor for his son in the middle of a storm. Julian thought of his own penthouse, a monument to his success, and realized with a sickening lurch that it was not a home, but a tomb, sterile and empty, a place where no one would ever be waiting for him. The quiet dignity he'd witnessed at the airport wasn't a mask. It was the real thing. It was integrity forged in fire. Their afternoons in the park became a ritual. The F-16 model, once a broken toy, was now a shared project, a tangible symbol of a connection that was slowly, carefully being built. Julian learned that Marcus had been in the Air Force, though he was always vague about the details, saying only that he'd flown a bit before Leo was born. He spoke more of the challenges of single fatherhood, of navigating school systems, and finding reliable childcare on a janitor's salary. In turn, Julian found himself talking, not about stock options or market caps, but about his own childhood, about his fascination with taking things apart and putting them back together. He spoke of the simple joy of making something work. He never mentioned his company or his wealth, and Marcus never asked. In the small, sun-dappled world of their park bench, he wasn't Julian Vance, CEO. He was just Julian, the man who knew how to fix the airplane. Leo was the bridge between them. He would often tug on Julian's sleeve, leading him to a patch of dandelions or a line of marching ants, demanding his attention with a look. He would fill pages of his notepad with drawings for Julian, of the 3 of them on the bench, of the F-16 flying through a sky filled with smiling suns, of Julian's severe face slowly morphing into one with an upturned mouth. One day, Julian arrived at the park to find Marcus looking troubled, staring at his phone. "Everything all right?" Julian asked. "Landlord's selling the building. We have 60 days to move. Rents everywhere have gone up. I don't know where we'll go." Julian's mind immediately went into problem-solving mode. He could write a check. He could buy the building. He could solve this problem with a single phone call. But he stopped himself. That was the old Julian's way, using money as a tool, a lever, a weapon. It would change the dynamic between them, re-erect the walls he had only just begun to dismantle. Instead, he sat down. "We'll figure it out," he said, the word "we" feeling both foreign and profoundly right. "Let's look at listings together. I can help you look." Marcus looked at him, a deep, searching gaze, and then he nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. For Julian, this quiet moment of shared burden felt more real than any business partnership he'd ever forged. The F-16 was nearly complete, its broken wings seamless, its body painted and polished. It was no longer a broken thing, but something whole and restored. The safety of their small world was an illusion. The world Julian had built for himself was predatory, and it had not forgotten him. Sterling Croft, a notoriously ruthless competitor, had been quietly buying up Vance Innovation stock, preparing for a hostile takeover. Sterling was a man who saw business as a zero-sum game, a war where empathy was a fatal weakness. Julian, feeling a newfound sense of balance, decided to open up to Marcus in a way he never had with anyone. They were sitting on the bench one evening, the park empty except for them, Leo asleep with his head in his father's lap. "The reason I am the way I am, or was," Julian began, his voice low. "I started my first company with my best friend. We built it from nothing in my garage. I trusted him with everything. One day, I came into work and the locks were changed. He'd used a loophole in our partnership agreement to push me out, taking all of my code, all of my ideas. A month later, he married my fiancée. The confession hung in the air, raw and painful. I promised myself then I would never be weak again, never trust anyone. I would build an empire so large, so powerful, that no one could ever touch me." He looked at Marcus. "And I did, but I built a prison." Marcus listened, his expression one of deep empathy. "A fortress can keep people out," he said quietly, "but it can also keep you in." Just then, Julian's phone buzzed, a harsh, insistent sound. It was his COO. Sterling had made his move. The story had just broken online. A smear piece, complete with paparazzi photos of Julian in the park with Marcus and Leo. The headline read, "Billionaire CEO's Bizarre PR Stunt. Julian Vance befriends airport janitor for man of the people image." The article painted Marcus as a pawn and Julian as a manipulative monster. The war had begun, and Sterling had chosen to make Marcus and Leo the first casualties. Sterling Croft cornered Julian at a charity gala 2 nights later. He was a man who radiated a cold, reptilian charisma. "Julian, my friend," Sterling began, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Quite the mess you're in. The board is spooked. This common touch of yours is making them nervous." "Leave him out of this, Sterling," Julian said, his voice dangerously low. "Oh, I will, as soon as you step aside," Sterling purred. "Or you could fight. But to win this, you have to be the man you were a year ago. The shark. You need to cut this sentimental baggage loose. Hold a press conference. Denounce the story. Call the man an acquaintance, a misunderstanding. Throw him under the bus. Show the board you still have the killer instinct. It's the only way you save your company." The ultimatum was a dagger. To save his empire, he had to destroy the one pure thing he had found. He had to become the man who muttered insults in airport lounges, the man who saw people as collateral damage. The choice was between his prison and his humanity. For the next few days, Julian was a ghost. He took Sterling's advice not by denouncing Marcus, but by disappearing. He stopped going to the park. He didn't answer Marcus's texts. He threw himself into the corporate battle, his days a blur of strategy meetings and legal calls, the old armor sliding back into place. But it no longer fit. It was cold and heavy, and every night he would go home to his silent penthouse and stare at the simple crayon drawing of the smiling sun, feeling the profound weight of his cowardice. He was losing the battle for his company, but the far more important war was for his soul, and he was on the verge of surrender. The final desperate move to save his company required a face-to-face meeting with a key investor in Tokyo. Julian booked a seat on the last commercial flight of the night. He was exhausted, defeated, and hollowed out. As he settled into his first-class seat, he saw them. Marcus and Leo were walking down the aisle toward the economy section. Their eyes met for a moment across the cabin divide. Julian saw the deep hurt in Marcus's expression, the confusion in Leo's. Marcus gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod and continued on, a father protecting his son from yet another disappointment. Julian's heart fractured. Hours later, somewhere over the Pacific, the world fell apart. A sickening lurch, a terrifying groan of stressed metal. The plane dropped 1,000 feet in seconds. Lights flickered, oxygen masks deployed, and the cabin filled with screams. A storm, the pilot announced. A microburst of unprecedented violence. Then, a new sound. An electrical fizzle, followed by a chilling silence from the cockpit. The cabin door flew open, and a flight attendant, her face pale with terror, stumbled out. "The cockpit, a power surge. They're incapacitated," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the din of the storm and the rising panic. She took a breath and screamed into the intercom. "Is there anyone on board with flight experience? A pilot? Please, is there anyone on board who can fly a plane? Are there any fighter pilots on board?" Panic turned to pandemonium. People were crying, praying. Julian was frozen, his own mortality a cold certainty. Through the chaos, he saw Marcus. He was unbuckling his seatbelt. He looked at Leo, his face a mask of fierce, protective love. Then he stood up. "I can," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the noise. But no one was listening. The aisle was a logjam of terrified passengers. This was the moment, the choice. His company, his wealth, his life. It was all meaningless noise. All that mattered was the man in the back of the plane and the little boy who trusted him. The old Julian would have stayed in his seat, saved himself. The new Julian, the one forged on a park bench, stood up on his chair. "Everyone, be quiet," he roared, his voice echoing with a command authority no one had ever heard from him before. The cabin fell into a shocked silence. "This man is a pilot. He can fly the plane. Now sit down and clear a path for him. Now!" He didn't wait. He jumped into the aisle himself, pushing, pulling, and commanding people back into their seats. He was no longer a CEO, but a man on a mission. A bodyguard for the janitor he had once scorned. He cleared a path all the way from economy to the cockpit, and as Marcus passed him, their eyes met. There was no time for words, only a shared understanding that was deeper than any language. Julian had made his choice. The next hour was a lifetime. Marcus's voice, impossibly calm, came over the used intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Marcus Thorne. I am a former United States Air Force pilot. We've sustained some damage, but the aircraft is stable. We're going to work with air traffic control to find a safe place to land. Please remain seated and follow the instructions of the flight crew." His voice was a lifeline in the storm. He was a master, his every action precise and confident. He wrestled the wounded plane through the turbulent skies, his quiet competence a stark contrast to the chaos he had inherited. Julian sat on the floor in the galley, out of the way, listening to the calm, steady voice of the man he had judged so cruelly. He had seen power his whole life, the power of money, of influence, of fear. But this was different. This was the power of quiet, profound skill, of a man who had been trained for the worst and met it with unwavering courage. After what felt like an eternity, the plane broke through the clouds. An airfield, lights blazing in the pre-dawn darkness, appeared below. The landing was rough, but safe. As the plane rolled to a stop, the cabin erupted in cheers, sobs, and applause. When the doors opened, the tarmac was flooded with emergency vehicles, reporters, and officials. Marcus was a hero, but he ignored the clamor. His only concern was Leo. Julian found them near the emergency stairs. He didn't offer money or resources. He didn't make promises. He walked up to Marcus, the noise of the world fading away, and simply said, "Thank you." Then he knelt down, so he was eye level with Leo, whose small hand was gripping his father's. "Your dad," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. is the bravest man I have ever met." Leo looked from Julian's earnest face to his father's weary one. A flicker of something momentous moved behind his dark, intelligent eyes. He took a small, shaky breath. "Daddy," he whispered, the sound small, fragile, but perfectly clear. Marcus froze, his eyes widening. He dropped to his knees, pulling Leo into an embrace so tight it seemed he was trying to merge their two souls. Tears streamed down his face. Over his son's shoulder, he looked at Julian, his eyes conveying a gratitude so profound it needed no words. The world could have its hero. He had his son back. In the aftermath, Sterling Croft's takeover bid imploded. The story of the heroic janitor pilot and the CEO who championed him was irresistible. Sterling's ruthless tactics, exposed in the light of Marcus's quiet heroism, made him a pariah. Julian let the company go, selling his controlling interest to a more benevolent firm, feeling not a sense of loss, but of liberation. 6 months later, the sun was warm on Julian's back. He was on his knees in a patch of rich, dark earth, pulling up a stubborn weed. The garden was a chaotic, beautiful work in progress, surrounding a modest but comfortable house he and Marcus had bought together. The sound of laughter filled the air. Leo, no longer silent, was chasing a butterfly across the lawn, his voice a constant, joyous stream of chatter. Julian had channeled his fortune and his energy into a new venture, a non-profit foundation, run with Marcus, dedicated to helping veterans leverage their unique skills in the civilian world. He was no longer building an empire of things, but a community of people. Marcus came out of the house carrying 2 glasses of lemonade, a smile on his face. He handed one to Julian. They stood together, watching Leo, the silence between them comfortable and complete. The broken model of the F-16 sat on the mantelpiece inside, a reminder not of what was broken, but of how the most fractured things can be made whole again, stronger in the places where they were repaired. Julian finally understood that real value wasn't measured in stock prices or market share, but in the quiet, unshakable strength of a human heart willing to open itself to another.